Oh, that's
Right, we are live, everyone.
all right. Thank you so much, Ben. Yes, those things can be an unexpected blessing when your conditions change. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
All right. So for everyone who is filtering in and joining us, we'll just take another minute or so and we will get started with our Thursday webinar. Welcome. And then do you live in New Mexico?
Um, no, I live with my husband in his homelands in California and Hawaii, but I'm in New Mexico all the time.
All the
That's
time.
home forever. Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we're all wearing our Deb Holland for Governor t-shirts around here. So, and many friends out campaigning. And so,
That is awesome. Yeah.
yes. She has her t-shirts. I should have worn it today. It was actually hanging in my closet, but it says "Be Fierce" and has the the New Mexico symbol. And I wore it actually to give a paper at the Society for American Archaeology meetings a couple of weeks ago, and everybody's like, "Wow, that's amazing! What's that?" So I got to do my pitch for Deb Holland at the same time, so it was good.
Are you an archaeologist?
hmm I mean,
Okay.
mostly I'm an administrator at this point in my career, but I was once an archaeologist. So
Okay, I do have some commentary about archaeology in here. And this the whole point of yes. Now I'm even more scared, but that's okay. We will just get through
no,
it.
no. Yes, there is much commentary on archaeology in the world, and all well deserved. So we accept all kinds of constructive criticism around here. So do not worry.
Well, I don't know if it's criticism, but I need to interact with more archaeologists, I think. Yes.
All right. Well, on your next trip back to the Four Corners area, you have a standing invitation. We would love to have you interact with more archaeologists than you ever wanted to know. So we have many up here.
I love that.
All right. Well, with that, everyone, I think we're just about 1 minute past 4 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our Thursday webinar. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'll start with a couple of our usual introductions. If this is your first time joining us, we are a nonprofit research and education center here in beautiful Southwest Colorado. And there is more information available on our website, and you can also email us. We're only on Zoom today. We are still working the kinks out of our Facebook streaming, but we have had some developments, so we hope to get there soon. If you have questions during our speaker's presentation, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and then they won't get lost in the chatting that happens on the chat. And please also do check out our YouTube channel if you haven't yet, and you can find our past webinars and go back a few years now and watch them. I'd like to begin with some acknowledgements. Crow Canyon acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Diné, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. With the work that we're doing at Crow Canyon, we seek to bring light into the darkness of memory that these lands, waters, wildlife, and her descendants hold as a result of policies of removal, genocide, and displacement. We seek paths that support and align with Indigenous people and communities. With gratitude, we honor the contributions of present-day Indigenous communities, descendants, and the colleagues with whom we partner who guide our work and our mission. A few little announcements. Our interns have just arrived this week. They're amazing. You can actually, we don't have a QR code up, but there is a section on the website for interns. You should check it out. You can read their bios. And as I was looking at it today, I just realized that we have most of our past interns over the last 4 decades, including yours truly, listed on the website, and many of our employees who started their careers as interns at Crow Canyon. So please do check it out. And you may may be hearing more throughout the summer about our awesome folks working in the field, in the lab, in education, in archaeobotany, and in faunal research. So we have some amazing folks as usual this year. If you haven't yet, here you can scan this QR code and take a look at our spring appeal and some of the education programs from everything from 4th grade through 12th grade, college students, graduate students that we are, as always, raising money for here at Crow Canyon. So please do check it out. And a point of pride, this quote that we're using comes from one of our students who is basic 14-year-old student who can pretty much do my job at this point. So some pretty amazing folks that come through our programs. And just a little spoiler alert that involves our speaker today. We have the Indigenous Foodways Workshop, a 3-day immersive program that is coming up in August. You can sign up for this, especially if you're in the area. So please do go ahead and scan the QR code and check it out, and you would actually be able to meet in person our speaker today, as well as some of our other friends, Mary Wiaki, Reina Bantia, who's done these programs for us before, and it's going to be absolutely incredible. Over the next couple of weeks, next week, I will be out on one of our travel programs next week, but my colleague, John Jahate, will be moderating Staking Futures Together, mediating conflict through games in ancient North America. And then I will be back for Save History, How to Protect Archaeological Sites from Looting and Vandalism with Shannon Coel and Anastasia Walhovid. So please keep showing up the next couple of weeks. Again, this is always when we do a huge thank you. Crow Canyon is almost entirely supported by your generosity as an entire organization. And then also our webinar series, which is entirely free, is also supported by your donations. Thank you so much to all of you who donate all the time, sometimes every week. And a special thank you to everybody who's been donating in memory of our beloved colleague and friend, Taylor Hasbrook, who invented our webinar series at the start of the pandemic when people couldn't travel. So we're just so grateful to Taylor and so grateful to be able to carry on her work, and grateful to all of you who have been making contributions in honor of Taylor and to keep our webinar program going. All right, without further ado, I am so excited to introduce our distinguished speaker today. A-dae Romero-Briones is the Vice President for Policy and Research, California Tribal Fund, Native Agriculture and Food Systems Investments. She was born and raised in Cochiti Pueblo in New Mexico, and also comes from family in the Hog Creek, Oklahoma area on the Kiowa side. She has dedicated her career to supporting Native communities and advancing equitable food systems. Her work spans nonprofit leadership, community development, and academic research, always with a focus on tribal food sovereignty and agricultural sustainability. She holds degrees from Princeton University, Arizona State University's College of Law, and the University of Arkansas School of Law, where she specialized in food and agricultural law. She is a U.S. Fulbright Scholar. A-dae is honored to contribute to organizations like FACT, Food Animal Concerns Trust, the National Academy of Sciences Maternal Health Board, and Civil Eats. She approaches her role as Vice President of Policy and Research for Native Agriculture and Food Systems Investments with gratitude, aiming to elevate Native voices and foster meaningful change. A-dae, thank you so much for coming and talking to all of us today.
Okay, thank you for having me. And before I fiddle with my computer, I do want to acknowledge that I began the conversation today with Taylor. And while it was a short time frame, considering many of the folks at Crow Canyon have a longer relationship with her, I acknowledge that she was part of these conversations and the development of this program, and I hope my words honor her and honor my communities in moving forward. So I just want to acknowledge and appreciate her. Okay, let
So much.
me get here. Okay, let's try this. can you just let me know if you can see my PowerPoint?
It looks perfect.
Okay. So today, well, first, thank you everybody for coming and spending some time with me this evening or this afternoon or wherever you may be. In Pueblo communities, we acknowledge the beginning of event, usually with a prayer, but so today this is my short prayer was to Taylor, my short acknowledgement, and we'll just go ahead and jump into the material. Again, I don't intend to offend the archaeologists in the room. And if I do, please have type in questions or ask me questions and we can continue the dialogue. Part of my presentation is meant to stir conversation and to increase understanding both among Indigenous communities and the archaeological community and the academic community. So again, that's my disclaimer, and let's jump into it. So today we're going to talk about domestication, specifically agricultural domestication, but domestication is a funny word. And all its connotations, uh, hint at a relationship between two entities, one having power over the other. And so this presentation is meant to examine exactly what that means. And I do so from the food systems lens because that's what I love and that's what I do and that's who I work with. On the screen, you will see the predator made out of corn. I got this graphic from Ricardo Salvador, who is a genius. He is one of the foremost maize experts in the country from both the indigenous side. He comes from Oaxaca, which is considered one of the places where corn was born scientifically. And he also worked in mainstream corn production at Iowa State. So if you don't know his work, Ricardo Salvador is an amazing indigenous scholar that both approaches maize evolution from an indigenous and scientific perspective, and you can often see the conflict in his written work. Before I get started, I know it was mentioned that I was born and raised in Cochiti. I am also from the Kiowa tribe, and I state this in the beginning because it does inform my positionality in the information that I'm sharing. And the large majority of the information and my understandings come from these communities. I am very much a reflection of these two places, and hopefully nothing I say gets back to my grandma and she is not happy with what I'm presenting. And speaking of my grandma, these are the families this is the family I come from in Cochiti. I am the little girl who is, oh, sorry. I am the little girl who is right here. Sorry, I have pop-ups. Who is right here in the Manta. I am sitting next to my great grandma. Her name was Magdalena Chalon. This is my mother and grandmother. And Magdalena is actually the little baby who is being held in the little white dress. And this is my grandparents, Percy and Zero Romero. And this is my Kiowa family. I come from the Comulti and Horse and Ware families. Um, I say this because if anybody knows anything about the Southwest, I'm very much a product of the Southwest. The Kiowas traded with the Pueblos for generations. And in the beginning, it wasn't a volunteer trade. It was more like raids. And so there's a constant, I think it constantly reflected in my own personality that I constantly seek like balance and understanding because they're very different communities. One's follows the buffalo and is on the plains, and that is reflected in the culture. The other is sedentary agriculturalist, has been in the same place for hundreds and thousands of years. I married into Big Valley Rancheria, which is a community in Northern California. My husband is Hawaiian and Pomo, and my children are being raised as Pomo Hawaiian kids. And of course, the Southwest is nowhere near large bodies of water. And now I live near a large body of water, and so I'm having to come to my own peace with that. And I do not find the ocean peaceful as most people do. It actually agitates a lot of my stresses, and so I'm learning how to live in this environment. So part of this presentation reflects those learnings as well. I work for First Nations Development Institute, and this is in addition to working at First Nations Development Institute, I also teach at Stanford University, but First Nations is like the heart of this presentation because the large majority of the information I'm sharing came directly from the communities we work with. First Nations is this is the program I run. First Nations is a philanthropic intermediary, which means we give money to communities all across the nation, tribal communities and tribally led nonprofits. I work primarily in the food and health space. Most of my portfolio is based on food, so I get to work with tribal communities and tribally led nonprofits all across the United States, Alaska, and Hawaii on indigenous food systems. And these are some of our programs in that arena. We also did the movie Gather. If you haven't seen it, it's on Netflix or you can download it on Apple. But it's a documentary on indigenous foodways, and we visit 3 different communities. We actually visited like 11, but 3 of them made it in the film. And we have grants that are associated with that movie, but we also have other grants in native food economies, native food security, and we have a Kellogg's Food Fellows program. So we give approximately, this is an old graphic, but we've given approximately $20 million to different communities all across the United States, Alaska, and Hawaii. And most of the beginning information comes from working with these communities for over 10 years. And so all of that background to say like what I know and what I'm sharing with you is rooted in like my own experiences and understanding based on my interactions in these communities. Although like I do work in academia, like what I see and how people talk to me about food and food systems is really important. And I have to juxtapose that with what I learn in the academic setting and what I read, and often they are not the same thing, and often they are in conflict. So in this presentation, we're gonna go over some of those frameworks of how I approach the work. We'll look at the indigenous understandings of food systems, which I've learned through the hundreds of grantees that we've worked with. And then we'll look at how that compares to Western understandings of food systems and how both food systems are kind of supported or not through archaeology, how they're framed in indigenous worldviews, and then how these concepts are institutionalized, meaning how we reflect them back in like solutions we're developing for current issues, for current understandings and problems. I'm just gonna get my phone just so I can see the time because I can talk about this stuff for hours. Um, Most importantly, when we're talking about food systems, I say food systems, but sometimes people refer to the content as like an economy, a food economy. What I've learned very quickly in working in Indian country is that the economic terms often make tribal people very uncomfortable because there's an assumption that we're always talking about capitalism when we say economy, and capitalism is very efficient at excluding a lot of people and certain populations. And Cochiti, Kiowa, and many other tribal communities are often excluded from the jump. And so when we talk about economy or food systems, I'm really talking about a society's system of managing their resources, which is inclusive of food and other natural resources, and not necessarily about capitalism. But we will touch on that in the upcoming slides. Um, and so when I'm talking about indigenous food systems, I may use words that can be interpreted in a capitalist system or in an indigenous system. And they're not always the same thing. And we see that reflected in the kind of grants that come into First Nations, because like a food system is a food system. There's like things that exist in both systems. There's food, there's resources, there's people who eat the food, there's land, there's water. Like all of these things are managed somehow. What the difference is in how they're managed and the relationships between those things. And so when I'm talking about indigenous food systems, I'm recognizing that food is connected to all of the institutions that are within a given society. And so in a mainstream food system, that society usually measures those relationships by monetary values. And so you see these bars on this graphic. It reflects the monetary measurement of how food is connected to all of these things, all of these institutions. In an indigenous system where it's not necessarily managed by monetary values, it is directly connected to the people and the institutions. And so when you think about the lack of food, oftentimes you will, depending on what system you're in, the solution will be, well, we should give more money or give more financial support to those who don't have food, which is a mainstream response to a problem. In an indigenous food system, the question is like, why does this person not have food, and what is going on in our institutions that is not allowing this person to have food, so we have to fix it. In a mainstream food system, all we really know is that like there's a lack of resources, and so the responses correspond to how we think about our institutions and how we measure them. Most importantly is this idea of collective resources. What we found in almost every single one of our grants is Indigenous people assume there's that the person reading their application understands collective resources. When we talk to funders or people working in mainstream food system, the idea of collective resources just is really hard to wrap their mind around, partly because like that's not how mainstream food systems are set up, because land, energy, water, and the environment can all be unitized or commodified, and it can be measured or valued by monetary values. In an indigenous food system, when the idea of collective resources exists, that means there has to be some community system to manage that, and that both of those systems, whether you acknowledge collective resources or you don't, purports to influence the type of behaviors within that community. Um, And most importantly, in indigenous food systems, the idea of health is a collective resource. So like when somebody's sick, it's not the fault of the individual, it's not retributive. I can never say that word. It's not the fault of the individual. Um, there's something within that community that like makes this person sick, so we have to fix that. In a mainstream food system, health is an individualized kind of resource, and so like when somebody's sick, it's their responsibility to fix it, and usually it's through monetary means like access, paying for the doctor, or access to healthcare systems, which also cost money. But these are very stark differences because when we look at how we see a food system, it determines like how we measure the success of that food system. So when we have individual measurements, if people are eating, if households are eating, if individuals are not hungry, then it's a success. In an indigenous food system, the community, if the community is the measurement, like the entire community needs to be eating. And all of these lend itself to the types of behaviors, again, that are within this society. So in the indigenous food system, like cooperative skills are highlighted. The way you communicate with people is highlighted. Like your empathy is like your ability to understand others or to sense when something is wrong with somebody else is really important. In the mainstream food system, we're looking more at specialized skills or individual performance that leads to more like monetary value. So like we measure things like how the annual income of people or how much they're able to garner like social media, like all these individual measurements are behaviors that are encouraged based on the type of food system we operate in. So most of our grants come from an indigenous food system, but most of our funders come from mainstream food systems. And so we're always having to articulate what the differences are and why most of our grantees want to have community gatherings or look at how much food they give away rather than how much money they make, or look at how much, mainstream food systems loves monetary measurements. So like they want how much produce did you grow? And in an indigenous food system, it's how much produce, it's not about the quantity, it's about how well it fits into the environment. And all of this to say, this is how I understand food systems and the differences, and it influences how I study food. And so when I think about my own community or the communities I work with, this is the food economy. And it's very different than a mainstream diagram that you may see, which often a mainstream diagram is going to have the producers, which are growers, which are distributors, and then it comes to marketers, and then it gets to consumer. It's very linear. In tribal communities, there's all these facets that must be part of a food economy in order for that economy to be healthy. And this is generalized. There are 574 recognized tribes in the country, but this is like good generalization. Um, there's nuances, of course, but this is most of the pieces that need to exist in a tribal food economy. One, you need to have access to land, fire, water, and seeds. If you don't have access to those things, the food economy is dead in the water. It's not going many places. And so when we fund things like Standing Rock, which was a fight for access to both water, clean water, and land, um, that's food systems work to me. When we support like dam removal in the Klamath River, that's access, that's food systems work to me. They don't that's not necessarily the case for other food funders, but for me it is. And so land, fire, seeds, and water, you need access to those things. And from there, you get plants and animals. But plants and animals existing on their own is one thing, but then you need the hunters and harvesters to actually be able to tell you what's going on with the plants and animals. So they're like interpreters of that world. And then you get into growers and ranchers, which is more what growers and ranchers are like folks who actually intentionally grow crops like corn, like squash, like beans. But that is part of the diagram that is only after the first half of this. But that's what most people understand as agriculture and food systems. In tribal communities, you need ceremonies, you need ways to connect with generational knowledge. And so we often do that through art. We often do that through people who cook for us. I call them processors. Most people call them cooks. And then the bottom half of the diagram, you get into more mainstream understandings of what a food system is. You have retail and restaurants, you have brick and mortar grocery stores. Those are the things that funders love to fund. And those are the things that most people understand as a healthy food system because they can see brick and mortar. We live in a capitalist system. And so going into the store and buying something is an indicator for an economy, not necessarily for an indigenous food economy, but for a capitalist economy. And so more recently, we see more food entrepreneurs. I would put chefs in that category because they are almost selling a knowledge based on like indigenous foods. We have farmers markets. Farmers markets are really, really important in Indian country because it allows growers to step into a capitalist economy, but also step out of it. Like it's not a permanent station within a food economy. So food farmers markets are really, really important. You can come in and out. It allows for some flexibility. Now we have institutions, we have tribal law that are trying to support like tribal food economies, especially around like seed protection and sharing of food. And then lastly, we have waste, which is like at the end of this, you should have zero waste. That is the marker of an indigenous food economy, and that's really important because it connects to what I'm going to say about archaeology. But you should have zero waste after the food economy is completed, after this cycle is completed. And you think about mainstream food systems where the food economy is probably one of the biggest waste contributors in our one of the institutions that contributes the biggest waste in our society. Um, so let's talk about all of those. Those are my understandings of food economy, and that's how I view food systems. Um, and so let's get into like talking about domestication and talking about agriculture and what that means. So there is a stigma around agriculture. It was used as a tool to civilize. It was used as a tool to remove our people from the land. And that's from Andrew Golbin, and he's from Tulalip Indian community, but he summarizes this well. And again, I come from the Southwest. I come from a place where we've been practicing agriculture since time immemorial. And when I heard this, when I heard Andrew speak, I realize that even my understanding of agriculture may be different than what mainstream understands agriculture to be. And what is that? What is the differences? And what are those understandings? So I went to a lot of school. My grandpa is a born and raised in Cochiti. So is my grandmother. They raised me, and my grandpa jokes that I went to all this schooling just so I could come back and be a farmer in Cochiti. And really, that came because I went to school. I loved, I practiced law. I was a tribal judge. I was trying to help tribal kids. And I realized that if I wanted to help people, I needed to figure out where they're most whole. And I was most whole when I was in the field with my grandfather. And so I went to study agriculture. But the agriculture I was studying, like at the University of Arkansas, was not the Coach T agriculture that I knew. And so it was like I was studying agriculture and learning exactly what they meant by that at the same time. And so these are some of my understandings. The way we understand agriculture in the American timeline and even in archaeology is that there's revolutions in the agricultural timeline. The first revolution was when hunter and gatherers transitioned to agriculture. And this is where we see like domestication happen. And there's a lot of literature on this transition. And most of the literature that I've read either leave out indigenous people altogether as like cavemen or as like the stage before like people became civilized. And so this era, the first agricultural revolution, is to me the most interesting of the agricultural timelines. It's all interesting, but the first one is most interesting because this is where I actually think archaeology and the American timeline gets it wrong. The second agricultural revolution happened when you mechanize agriculture. So think about the combustible engine. You think about um, tools that become more efficient in the yield that they're producing. So it's no longer by the human hand. And in this transition, where are indigenous people? There was actually an era where um, the federal government would offer tractors to tribal farmers if they sent their children to boarding school. And so this was like actually used as leverage. Access to this mechanization became leverage for indigenous people across the globe to actually participate because the narrative is that mechanization made you more efficient, made a more efficient farmer, created greater yields and could feed more people. And I actually think we get a lot of things wrong in this second revolution as well. But what I'm going to focus primarily on the first agricultural revolution in this. The third agricultural revolution is the Green Revolution, and that's when we see the presentation of like genetic engineering and pesticides, where we see a lot of manipulation of natural processes. And we don't really see a lot of Native people with like in the literature in this revolution because there's like an assumption that Native people don't do science. Um, I've Personally, I've been called anti-science a lot, which is not true at all, but I think this is where we see a lot of the social ills that we see in our environments today really came from here, and really it was tied to the eras of war, World War II, and a lot of the science that was developed there. And it's reflected in the relationship in agriculture. It's a very militarized approach to land management and plant growth. Um, and now we're in the fourth revolution of agriculture. And my interpretation of this revolution is that we are in a competing environment. So like we have organic revolution, which started arguably in the 1970s. Now we have like regenerative agriculture, we have deep ecology, we have digital agriculture, we have technological agriculture, like all of these forms of agriculture are kind of competing for what this era is going to look like. A lot of it depends on our decisions now, but it's really in response to the third revolution of agriculture. Like we want to be different, we want to do better because again, that was like a really militarized war machine type of relationship we had with land and agriculture. There is more interest now in what indigenous agriculture looks like, more than I've ever seen. Um, and unfortunately, like I'm very cynical. We, I see it as like there's more interest because there's a need to um, reverse engineer some of the processes that have happened. Um, and so I'm skeptical about often sharing those things. Um, but we can talk more about that. I won't get into that. So let's talk a little bit about archaeology. Of so when I think about archaeology, and I've read a lot of archaeological records about agriculture, a lot of the archaeological evidence and the record is formatted on physical manifestations of the past. And so I'm thinking about ruins, I'm thinking about carbonized seeds or plant impressions, and all of these things um, inform scholars about what agriculture looked like in the past. Um, and a lot, the era of carbon dating was pretty revolutionary because we could then date carbon seeds and other carbon-based materials to certain time frames. But all of that to me is based on the interpretation of the scholar. So like even if I looked at a seed impression and Liz looked at a seed impression, we're both interpreting that information from different pedagogies. I'm going to see it different than she does, but what gets into the archaeological record and the literature is probably the more Western understandings of what that is. Also, there are limitations in like carbon dating because it's ranges as opposed to like specific dates. So there's a lot of room for, there's little room for interpretation, but there is still room for interpretation. And the most like confounding fact for me is that in archaeology, we're looking at facts and understanding what agriculture looks like. Um, but there's a fascination with why agriculture happened, and most of the literature has like several theories. One is like there's population collapse or population pressures that force hunter-gatherers to then become farmers, or there's like a climatic crisis that is happening in the environment, and so the people have to adjust to feed themselves. And those are both very dramatic narratives that, quite frankly, don't fit into what I understand to be a way of being in the world. Most indigenous communities have creation stories that are encoded with so much information um, that tie themselves to the lands that they're on, and that itself says something, that there's like an importance of relationships with those lands that should be propped up and respected. The theories about like population collapse or climatic crises, they all are valid. Of course, they're valid, but again, it doesn't speak to the relationship to the land. It speaks and focuses primarily on the human experience, um, and not necessarily the experience of the human within an environment. And so those pedagogies would definitely influence how you interpret facts and information, even though we may be looking at the exact same thing. And if you ever want to go down a rabbit hole, I would suggest looking for articles or books on agriculture and why agriculture happens. It's fascinating, and it gets kind of crazy for me. Um, and one time one of my colleagues asked, like, well, we can't really rely on indigenous creation stories as like record because they're all different. They all come from different places. And there's like no uniform creation story for many indigenous peoples, and that was their critique. And my response to that is like, yes, because we all come from different environments and we're all like different communities. And so we're looking at locality and we're looking at specific land practices in very specific places. And to me, that's the heart of what is missing in many of the Western approaches to how we look at agriculture. And so again, I'm learning about American agriculture because I know Cochiti agriculture, I know Kiowa food systems, but what is the American agricultural profile? And really, I looked at the history of American agriculture, and the Romans were some of the first people to actually create the square. Um, so when we think of agriculture, we think American agriculture. I usually see a plot, square plot. I usually see row crops. I usually see a tractor. I usually see corn, and I see a cow. And all of that is like the profile of American agriculture that came from Europe. Your Romans were the first to create these plots because they were a military society. They monocropped, they had to feed armies, and so they had to produce food in a very efficient way, and most likely on conquered lands. So conquest was part of their agricultural model. And so the relationship to the land wasn't there. So you could basically extract and exploit monoculture in order to feed the expanding army that was busy conquering other lands. And so they were directed, there were parts of the army that directly organized food growing. And then the Anglo-Saxons then replaced the Romans within Europe. And this is where we see the organization of labor because there was no longer militarization. Now you had to figure out how to get people to work without the force of without military force or violence. And so this is where you see like the introduction of capitalism into agriculture, where you have like poorer people then working for estates or people who had more resources. You see tenant farming, and this is where you actually start to see taxation and the role that food plays in how much profit is garnered from a piece of land. And again, all of this is tied to like Christian thought. And here I have Jewish thought. So the Torah was given, and it actually has information in there about how one is supposed to practice agriculture. But all of these things form the idea of what agriculture is supposed to look like. And this was formed prior to stepping on onto the New World. And so this is a quote from Jackie Thomas Rand. The land held an abundance that those eyes searching for agriculture could not see. And so I love this quote because I actually had an experience with this. I did have a funder who wanted to visit Indigenous agricultural projects. I took them to the Tohono O'odham community, and I they wanted to see where food was growing. And so one of our grantees took them out to the desert, and we're standing in the middle of the desert. And the funder says, okay, well, where is the farm? And the Tohono O'odham man said, you're standing right in the middle of it. And like the funder didn't get it because he couldn't see what the Tohono O'odham person saw, which was like abundance of food, whether it be saguaro cactus, whether that be the mesquite seeds, whether that be the birds. Like there was an understanding of that system that was readily apparent to the Tohono O'odham person, but wasn't readily apparent to someone who was used to seeing row crops and squared farms. And so, like, we see that same understanding play out in how we understand American agriculture today. Like Manifest Destiny was like based on the idea that people should be yeoman farmers, that we should have plots, we should have row crops, that you should be able to see those things. You should be efficient at feeding your community and making money. And all of that displaced indigenous understandings of food systems. And really, that is part of the problem. This is part of the issue, is like we are viewing agriculture from different standpoints and totally different understandings that continue to play out today. And this is part of domestication. Like domestication is that marker of yeoman farmership, but domestication is can be interpreted as both the period that man becomes control of the plant or the animal or the land, or domestication can be interpreted like from my Cochiti perspective as the moment that you become responsible for a plant, for a land and an animal, and that is a reciprocal relationship. But domestication, I think, can be played into either definition, but when we use the word and don't have the same definition or same understanding, it plays out in very different ways. And so when I think about, I have just a few more minutes, so just bear with me for a few more minutes, and then we'll do question and answer. When we think about the current ways domestication is playing out today, I think about the deer. So this photo, the photo on the right, is a photo from Cochiti by Joe Herrera, one of our prominent artists. And then I just read this book, The Age of Deer. It's very good. It talks about the domestication of deer and how now restaurants who serve deer are likely to get their deer from deer farms because it's like safer and it's for food safety considerations, like deer farms are becoming a thing. So you can buy a deer steak or deer ribs in New York City. Cochiti understandings of deer is that we are, if you look at the picture, we are responsible. The deer is centered in the photo. The man is little in the corner, and the man is like the footprints are searching for the deer, if not following the deer. To me, it looks like a wall that's protecting the deer. On the left side, you see the things that look like fins. Those are landscape, they're called check dams, and that's really how like people in the Southwest managed water. We had check plot dams, and so that is a shape or figure that speaks to the landscape, and the sun and the clouds are all based on this relationship between the deer and the man and the environment. But we have the continued domestication of deer. Now we see, of course, the domestication of salmon. Um, Salmon, it is the representative of the first wave of human exploitation, the species that marks the point at which humans and fish at hand large-scale environmental problems, and where domestication had to be launched to head off. It should be off extinction. And this is from a book called The Four Fish, and it's by Paul Greenberg. And when I read this book, I was also working with Klamath River communities that have been successful at removing the 4 dams so that the salmon can return. But of course, the American experience is that we need to domesticate the salmon in order to save them. The indigenous response is we need to correct their environment so that they can save themselves. And they've been successful in that. And really, we see salmon as the victims of the American agricultural model, because you have dams that were created to both divert water from specific places to farmlands. You have the removal of timber that were cleared to make farmlands. And when you remove that timber, you remove the lungs of the river so that the water is no longer as clean as it should be. And now you have, when the water is not clean, you also have pesticide now runoff into those rivers that are all damaging the salmon. And all of those things were part of the dam removal conversations from the Yurok tribe. I encourage everybody to read this article by Elsie DeBray, who talks about the integrity of the buffalo, because there is a movement to domesticate buffalo. Elsie specifically talks about the defense of integrity considerations for a true and just buffalo restoration movement. And the gist of the article is that buffalo and bison cannot be treated as cattle. You cannot raise them in a feedlot and then send them to slaughter and then put their meat out to market. Bison are not meant to be viewed in that way. Sorry. And so when I think about my own experience in Cochiti, this is, I'm sure some of you have been to a buffalo dance. If not, you should go. It's a very beautiful dance. Born and raised, I've seen this my whole life, and I didn't understand this dance until I visited Elsie in her buffalo ranch, where she has about 1,000 head of buffalo. We are literally dancing with the buffalo in the buffalo dance. And the woman is wearing white. That's considered the buffalo mother. If you didn't know, buffalo herds follow the oldest female, and it's the female who is responsible for caretaking of the herd. And so you have two young bulls that are protecting the buffalo mother. The hunter is leading the pack because the hunter should be protecting all of that herd. And the men, Pueblo men, are choreographing that dance. And so we are part of the system that protects or doesn't protect the buffalo. But this is like our stated roles in that our form of like domestication, which includes the domestication or the change of thought for us as humans and how we fit into these systems. And lastly, I'll share, this is my favorite picture. This was created by Wuha, who was sent to Carlisle boarding school in 1872. He made this photo in 1877. He was a prisoner at Fort Marion, Florida. He was one of the first Kiowa people to be imprisoned by the Army, and he was one of the first students at Carlisle Indian School. And in 1877, he understood his place in the world as the middle between the bison and the cow. And to me, it is still the same role. Like indigenous people are still playing that role between domestication and what people consider wild, but actually they exist in a natural world. And wild is not the right word. I haven't found the right word yet, but if you look at the picture on one side, you'll see the teepee and the community in the circle and on the left side of the cow, you'll see the church and you'll see the row crops and you'll see the farms. And indigenous people are still in the middle of the two, trying to negotiate the meanings between domestication and what we understand as agriculture. And our interpretations, for me, hold the key for like how we should be existing in the world to minimize our impact to environment and hopefully increase the beneficial relationships, not only for us, but for our world. And with that, I will stop my share.
Oh my gosh, A-dae. That picture is amazing. I took a picture of it with my phone while it was up. What a perfect
Yes.
bringing your talk all together. Thank you. Wow, so much. I could go down so many rabbit holes with you, and I hope that you will come back so that we can follow up, and I can practically hear from here all of our archaeologists furiously taking notes, just like I was. Just maybe a couple things. Uh, you started out your talk saying, there's some conflicts between my work in academia and work in communities, and I jotted that down because I'm like, oh, I can't wait to hear which ones she's going to bring out. And I want one of the things I wrote down while you were talking and sharing some of the perspectives on archaeology as well was uh, archaeologists who are trained in Western academics are trained to interpret archaeological data according to that chart that you put up that had the mainstream food systems chart and the indigenous food systems chart. And I'm looking at that and going, oh yeah, this is how they taught us, right? To interpret ancestral and indigenous agricultural economy and food systems is this one, not the other one, right? And thus, of course, as you observed, then that naturally leads to all of the conclusions about the dramatic narratives, right, in agriculture, right? If that's how you're trained to do it, then those are the conclusions that you're going to arrive at. And what struck me, and I'm sure struck our staff who are listening, that if they want to understand, right, the experience of humans in the environment, they're going to have to unlearn, right, all of that, right, unlearn those frameworks. So it gives me hope that you teach at Stanford, right, and that you're teaching this to students who, I'm old, so I was, taught decades ago, but given the folks who come through after their schooling, I'm sure they're still learning it in this way. So thank you for teaching the next generation, and we'd love to learn more. Do some of those conflicts kind of get discussed and resolved in your work, or do you feel like you're able to put these other frameworks out and maybe counteract some of that?
Yes, absolutely. And I did, well, it's not just me. I think
Yes.
there are brilliant indigenous thinkers who are finally putting, and not that we haven't, but finally getting publications and some airtime where we normally haven't. I think of Vine Deloria, who's been putting out some of the greatest works ever written,
Yeah.
but rarely people outside of Indian country read him in the way he should have been read. But there are some incredible Native students, and I do think when we think about how academia puts so much credence on written historical record, like we as a community should be questioning what is in that historical record. And really, I kind of just fell into this because I didn't understand the historical record. I was reading things about my own community that made no sense. And I was like, where is this information coming from? And so part of my journey has been to understand how the historical record is created. And it's not as objective as many of us would like to think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted, and I know we're just a couple minutes over, but if I could, I wanted to also point out the slide was so stark and informative where you had the different revolutions, right? Or Western identified revolutions. And the fourth revolution that you talked about is something we talk about and think about here too. And you mentioned that this interest, right, in indigenous agriculture, that there's a certain amount of cynicism or skepticism that, that you bring to that. And I've thought about that a lot too, as we think about what kind of research can we do that ties into indigenous interests and desires. I've also looked at that with a little bit of anxiety that is this just the next form of cultural appropriation or another form of cultural appropriation, right? Please save us now from the folly of Western capitalism and let us appropriate the indigenous food systems, which, you know, we know how that's gone in the past, right? So, but is, you know, for our scholars who might want to say, so how can we be useful and not appropriative, right, in this sort of interest in the fourth revolution? Is there maybe some thinking or advice or things that you might point folks to?
I think for me, the most important part of growing up Coach T was being able to be on the land of my ancestors with my community. And within that environment and within that relationship building, like it's not going to be one scholar, it's not going to be one community that defines what that looks like. Really, what matters is community. Like, are you part of a community? Are you part or close to an indigenous community? Do you have meaningful relationships? Are they willing to teach you the things you need to know to live in that environment? It's not just about like the production practices and the processes that they practice. It's also about the relationship they have to each other and the land. But most of the time, academia and people want like, give me your seeds, or give me the way
Right.
you manage your water, or give me the way you process the growth of these plants. It's less about the people and the land and more about the processes. And so if there was a way we could all figure out how to be in better relationship with one another, that's it. And it's hard. It's so hard. It's really hard. I acknowledge that, but I think that's what is needed.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. And I want to be respectful of your time because we're already a little bit over. But yes, of course. And that's what one of our colleagues who's a farmer at the Pueblo of Acoma, she always tells us, you might think that you're in relationship, but you're probably not. So why don't you start thinking about how you might get there? So.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, A-dae. And I'm so excited that we're going to be able to work with you in August, and hopefully you will want to keep working with us. So
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
thank you so much, and we will see you soon.
Okay, bye.